Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Vicky Gosling, OBE, is chair of GB Surfing and Rugby Centurions, board director at the British Olympic Association, board member and strategic advisor for the Invictus Games UK delegation, and CEO of GB Snowsport. She was formerly a board director at Responsible Finance and director at Sage. Vicky began her career in the Royal Air Force, where she became group captain at RAF Benson. Vicky, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
While researching this podcast, I came across the headline, How Britain Developed an Elite Alpine Skiing Programme on a Shoestring Budget. And it reminded me of one of my favourite previous episodes on Enter the Boardroom with Roger Martin, who talked about the strategy he applied to propel Tennis Canada to becoming a major force in tennis when they had no obvious to win. I'd love to hear the GB Snowsport strategy that you put in place and how you've executed that.
It's been a combination of factors, really. When you have limited financial resource, you have to be quite smart about how you use the resource and focused. And so what we did was really look at, I called it 5 key pillars. People, so just ensuring that actually we had world-class people actually delivering against our programs. Because when you look across the programs, we've got the 8 Olympic programs and 3 Paralympic programs. So when I'm talking about, that's the different disciplines in snowsport. And we needed world-class coaches to be delivering those programs for us. So whether we recruited them in from Switzerland and France and Austria and Canada and nations that have actually delivered world-class results before. And then just ensuring that we're putting the right support around these athletes. So in terms of the performance first mentality. So are we giving them the right nutritional support, strength and conditioning, physio, giving them access to venues, giving them access to snow because time on task is really important. And also innovation. So what equipment are they using? Is it the best equipment? It's that whole marginal gains piece. And really importantly, how do we make it a sustainable program? So in addition to the public, for everyone's aware that we are publicly funded. So in addition to that revenue, how could we make this an attractive proposition whereby we could get commercial investments as well to enable it to be more sustainable? And of course, with the financial resources that we were given, whilst that was fantastic in one hand, actually it was insufficient to get where we needed to go. So we were quite heavily reliant on co-funding. And then just having a very clear vision and a clear mission is critical to enable us to be aligned and to really be focused, laser focused on getting there. So it's been a combination of factors, a great team, a good, strong vision and mission, and effectively being incredibly focused and agile in how we've delivered against that vision and mission.
How do you think that was different from the competition? Because I imagine all the other countries probably would say they were doing the same things.
I think when you're faced with barriers, we're not blessed with mountain ranges and we're not blessed with much snow, are we? And we're limited financially in terms of how much investment we get because we're not a summer sport. We're not exactly a sport that people automatically say is a British sport that we're really good at. And I think that makes you more determined. So we've had to be really innovative in how we take the approach. It's the old saying, isn't it? How do you create hunger in paradise? So if you get everything, you've got snow on your doorstep and you're given oodles of resources to make it work. Is that the right thing? Does that enable you to do brilliantly? I think we've had to be really innovative and super smart in the way that we've used the limited resources we've had. And that laser focus effect that you are prioritizing the needs accordingly, really. You don't have any opportunity to be flabby or wasteful. I also think that we are truly blessed with a nation of Brits with grit. So when you look at the talent that we have, we've got some incredible talent who've done it the hard way, one could suggest. They haven't been blessed with an upbringing of, people think of snowsport, think of elite, think of rich, think of very wealthy individuals. Now that can be true in certain aspects, but not necessarily is that the case with our athletes. So we've got athletes who've got drive, got determination, and they've really gone for it. And I think the grittiness of our British athletes, the fact that we are in Britain, we know how to win. We've proven that in different, look at the way that we've delivered results in rowing or athletics or gymnastics. We've proven that we are very capable. We have great brains in the innovation space. And we've taken advantage of some of that, whether it be working with McLarens or whether it's with Williams who effectively built our sit ski for us.
Really interesting. So you've taken that where I suppose we are a world leader in automotive design and applied that into a new space to create the marginal gain in equipment.
Yeah, we've done that. One of the standout themes that I think is really pertinent to our success is the sense of team. If you think about it, if you look at a large nation like the USA, you get vast amounts of high profile talent in each of the different disciplines. We felt it was really important to create the sense of one team where we were all heading in the same direction, where we could really learn each of the disciplines. So whether it was alpine or snowboard cross or ski cross or freestyle ski or moguls or cross country, taking the lessons from each of the disciplines and sharing best practice, each of the different disciplines, to have sufficient communication and contact because they're overseen by a head coach and a performance director, that we take the lessons from one discipline across to another, whether that's to do with just psych advice or nutrition advice or strength and conditioning advice or just what structure do we need to put in place. But we've created a sense of one team, and that sense of team is incredibly powerful. I think it was Klopp that actually said it, where he talks about 70% team and 30% tactic. I speak about it in the same way. It's very much about the sense of team and everybody being accountable and everybody understanding their roles within this system so that they effectively can put that to good use and deliver against their responsibility.
Roger Martin, who I mentioned earlier, has this useful framework where he encourages people to think about the opposite choice. And if the opposite is not stupid of what you're doing, he says that's an operating imperative. Everybody should be doing it. And only if the opposite is not stupid is it a true strategic choice. What you're talking about there of sharing across the different teams, that feels like an operating imperative. Like, in a sense, shouldn't everybody be doing that? Or do you see that as a strategic choice?
When you look at the uniqueness of the different disciplines, culturally, they are quite different. Right? If you think about snowboard, the freestyle disciplines versus the cross-country discipline, or alpine, in fact. So when I first came in, I do think it's been a strategic choice because actually each of those disciplines were operating in silos. They each had their own brand. For example, you had Park and Pipe and you had British Alpine, British Cross Country. They were operating very much in silos with their own social media handles and their own way of doing things and their own budget. Actually creating this sense of team where you have the flexibility with budget, not with Alpine because we've since had that ring fenced by UK Sport, but where you have the opportunity to move and shift the dial and be agile. So prioritize your needs as they arise and use that sort of real strategic priorities, understand your own strategic priorities so you can shift the dial as you need to, has been key, really. So if you also think about the fact that we're operating in a time where climate change is incredibly difficult. So it's very challenging in a sport like snowsports, where you can have a World Cup scheduled in Austria 1 minute, and actually within days of going to go and do it, it's cancelled because ultimately the conditions aren't good enough. You have to operate on the hoof a little bit there because you've got athletes who've been primed, ready to go, and that's the direction they're heading in. And then suddenly it's cancelled. Where do you go next? Well, you've got a team over here that's already actually on the mountain, say the moguls team. You then seek to effectively move the team that's just had their World Cup cancelled, move them into the same accommodation, share the resources that they have, and create an opportunity with effectively what has been a disadvantage by having the whole thing cancelled. Whereas prior to that, the communication between the different disciplines wasn't particularly great. It wasn't cohesive and it felt very disjointed.
So I guess a country that had gone down that path of specialization might be advocating the benefits of being specialized, deeply focused, whereas you've gone down the path of collaboration and the flexibility that brings. If you'd had unlimited funding, what would have had to have been true to have convinced you that actually specialization would have been the right strategy versus collaboration?
I think if you had unlimited funding, I wouldn't have changed the brand, bringing everything under one umbrella, because actually I think we've created a really powerful brand. When you look at where we were 6 years ago, post Pyeongchang. We had a couple of medals in Pyeongchang, but the reality was we were doing okay in a couple of disciplines. You look at us today and we've actually got number one in the world in snowboarding with Mia Brooks, Kirsty Muir right at the top of the game in freestyle ski. Charlotte Banks has been number one in the world in border cross. The world team, herself and Hugh together, are the world team, number one team in border cross. You've had Ollie Davis in ski cross as podiumed. You've got Matteo Jenison is the junior world champion in moguls. You've got Michaela Gherkin-Schofield regularly on the podium in moguls. The men's alpine team are sitting currently at 6th in the world, ahead of America and Canada and Italy, who, by the way, have 600 resorts, right? You've also got cross country, Andrew Musgrave. We've got a really strong sprint team. And then in the para-alpine space, we've got the world number one and in the men's para-alpine for the downhill. Same with the women, with Menna Fitzpatrick. And then you've got Ollie Hill, previous Paralympian. We've created an opportunity whereby, on any given weekend, we're having a podium in at least one of the disciplines. So you've almost spread the risk as well. When you're thinking about the para and the collective, when you think about GB Snowsports, you might have one of those disciplines having a couple of bad weekends, right? Or getting off the boil slightly, but somebody else is filling the gap. So I think there's so much to be said about having that collective under one umbrella, and it feels powerful. So even if we had unlimited resource, that's not going to make us brilliant. We don't see some of this activity happening on the podium every weekend in every different discipline with some of the big nations who do have fairly much deeper pockets than we do, let's say, and snow on their doorstep. So I think there's a lot to be said. Even if we had unlimited resource, would I change it? Not necessarily. What I would do would be investing a lot more into the pipeline to enable our talent in the wider part of the funnel to be a lot deeper, to give us more opportunity at the top of the pipeline. So I'd definitely be investing more in that space. And I would certainly be putting more into the top athletes that we have right now, because as it stands today, we have great opportunity to get a number of golds in Milan Cortina. If money were no object, I think we have a much greater percentage chance of getting those golds rather than diluting them down or not getting them at all.
Really interesting. That echoes one of the key insights that I took from a book called Competition Demystified, which with various case studies showed that capital rarely determines an outcome. It just accelerates that outcome, whether that's good or bad. I'm curious to hear what the board's contribution has been on that journey.
I would say that I think what's really important is having a board that's completely aligned to the mission and the direction you're heading. And the board in general has been incredibly supportive and helpful in accelerating the journey to date. There is no doubt there have been bumps in the road, as I'm sure there are with many organizations where, you go through peaks and troughs where a board can be particularly functioning incredibly well and supportive, and moments when actually the board appears to be dysfunctional and not aligned. And indeed, individuals having a different agenda or not being aligned to the output or the direction of travel you're heading in can be really distracting. But of the whole, actually, we found that the board, in any organization, I think is critical to that success.
You said helpful. Can you give me an example?
Yeah, I would say one thing that we really needed actually on the journey was co-funding, accelerating co-funding and the depth of co-funding. I would say that the board played a critical role in supporting us with co-funding, particularly earlier on in the journey. That was incredibly helpful. Since that period, actually, I would say more recently, the board, we've had a new chair who comes into it with a marketing hat on. That brings a different dimension and a different skill set, which we found incredibly useful. So can look at it through a branding lens, can look at it actually in terms of the direction that we take in growing the branding, growing the opportunity for commercial revenue. So that's been incredibly helpful. And having individuals on the board that have a depth and breadth of a fresh viewpoint and bringing fresh thoughts to the board. We've got one particular individual that stands out on the board has come in from the film industry. So completely diverse skill set, but thinks about some of the challenges we face in quite a fresh way, in a really supportive, helpful way actually as well.
In moments when the board has hindered you on this journey?
I think it's when you find that you have individuals on the board who aren't necessarily aligned to the direction you're traveling and they have their own agenda or their own ideas that aren't, when it comes to strategic priorities, they're not right up there. Potentially, you may say that what motivates people to come on a board, Ollie, is it power? Is it recognition? Or is it giving back? Because there's many motivators for a board. I think if you find that it's recognition and power, you're in trouble. Okay. Because actually, I think that can create a behavior that's probably unwanted. And that's where you can see agendas being driven in a direction that aren't aligned to your strategic priorities. And so I have experienced that. I've experienced some dysfunctional behavior that definitely distracts from the day to day and hasn't been helpful. But on the other hand, I've experienced incredibly positive, really constructive, brilliant behavior that without which we wouldn't be where we are now.
Patrick Lencioni in his 5 dysfunctional of a team talks about striking that balance between having a team that's not always in agreement with each other, but at the same time, not always disagreeing with each other. When you have those people where you say they're not aligned with the strategic priorities, how do you differentiate in your mind when you're listening to them between actually this could be diversity of thought in action here and that's worth a challenge worth listening to versus, oh my gosh, they're pulling us completely out of shape. This is really unhelpful.
I think, open-mindedness is really important without a shadow of a doubt. But I think ultimately you set your strategic priorities. Well, you should set them collectively. Okay. So the board should be absolutely part of that strategic priorities decision-making process, because then they're aligned to it. And it's when it really stands out. And as an executive, I think when you're limited with resource, you have to be extremely focused on those priorities. And in order to achieve the end state, some of that type of skewing off to the right and heading down a rabbit hole, we wouldn't be where we are because we don't have the capacity to effectively be completely steered off ship. So I think coming to the table with great ideas and initiatives is one thing, and that's fantastic. But it's when you know and you understand and you can see that actually heading in a direction, this is where I think for me it is stand out. When you're heading in a direction that's going to be resource heavy, that's going to cost financially, and that is going to be distracting to the task in hand. Now, ultimately, what is our task in hand? Our task in hand is to win medals, without a shadow of a doubt, to go to the Olympics and to the World Championships and to win medals. And we have to have that at the forefront of our minds. And doing it, winning well, being cohesive as a team, and actually having a great culture. That's critical to our success. If you can see that something that's coming to the table is actually going to destabilize that and destabilize the direction of travel, I think that's the piece that that activity stands out. You can see it. And I think the good thing in that environment is to have people who really do understand the mission, are aligned to the mission, because then they back you and they stay with you and they don't let individual agendas effectively take over the direction you take or distract you.
It reminds me of that wonderful Colin Powell line of when we're thinking about what we want to do, if you don't challenge me, you're not my friend. But once we've decided what we're doing, if you then challenge me, you're not my friend. One of the things I sometimes wrestle with, though, is there are some divergent thinkers. I can think of various situations I've been in sort of board situations where there are divergent thinkers. And sometimes when you let them run with those thoughts, it can be really valuable. And sometimes it can reshape the way everybody is thinking, but sometimes it can be hugely destructive. And they don't always neatly fit into that sort of Colin Powell box, in my experience.
One of the individuals I was talking about earlier is a completely divergent thinker. I think you get to know the personalities, don't you? And it's great having check and challenge. And it is really helpful. It's really helpful having divergent thinkers. But it's divergent thinkers, let's get the facts straight. It's divergent thinkers that have the common goal in mind and have the end state in mind. And their divergent thought process is adding to that journey and to the end state. It's when the divergent thought process is effectively taking you off that journey and heading you down a rabbit hole that's going to strangulate you, quite frankly. That's the problem. And that's when they don't become your friend. The divergent thinkers I'm all for, massively for, particularly if they're innovative and they can get us to somewhere quicker, faster, more efficiently, more effectively. Brilliant. It's when you're actually going off piste, quite literally, and you're finding yourself up to your neck in powder and you can't get out. That's the problem.
As one person put it recently, when they start sounding like drunk chat GPT, you know you're in trouble.
Really good point. Really good point.
You went through a chair transition. Any lessons for a CEO board member listening to this that you took from that transition?
Yeah, I think being part of the process is really key. Both being a chair and being a CEO, you cannot underestimate that relationship and how critical it really is. You don't have to be buddies by any stretch of the imagination, but having shared values and shared objectives is critical. The good thing with that is enabling me to meet the potential chair candidates and enabling actually some of the exec to meet the chair candidates was super helpful, invaluable really, because that dynamic with chair and CEO and the trust that needs to be in place is critical to success. I've learned that through my experiences. You can see they have the drive, ambition and vision, and they are really keen for the direction you're heading on to succeed, because that changeover happened midway through a cycle. That could be quite destructive in a way, but far from it actually. It was great. The process was extremely helpful, and having the opportunity to meet these individuals was key.
Were there any things that you would do differently now if you're running that process again?
Yes, I think so. To be fair, I was brought into the process once the individuals had been streamlined down to the last sort of 3 candidates. Being brought in early in the process, I feel it would have been helpful. I think coming in at that, you just don't know who's been fished out. You might have missed a trick. I think it's just helpful because also the network that I have is quite large. So I subsequently found out about a couple of individuals who'd applied who would have been fantastic as well, right? In hindsight, or for others going through the process, I think having a transparent process where you're a part of the process earlier on is quite important.
That really resonates for me. When we've appointed advisory board members for our board, one of the things that I found most valuable about the process was I actually took the time to meet with all of the long list. I probably spent 2 days doing those calls, meeting with each of the individuals. I had whatever it was, 10, 15 unbelievably smart, experienced people all sharing their best thoughts and insights on the strategy of the business. And it's, wow, this is like an amazingly valuable experience, and getting that incredible diversity of thought, not to mention, the selected person obviously goes on to add lots of value after that. But that process I just thought was a really valuable thing for me as a CEO.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's the opportunity to expand your network with some hyper bright, intelligent people, as you say.
If you went back in time with the knowledge you've got now and you were sitting on your board at the start of your journey, what would be the most valuable things you could do as a board member?
When I first came in, there wasn't really a diverse mix, if I'm really honest. But in an ideal world, and now where we're heading, which is super helpful, is having the financial expertise, is having the marketing expertise, it's having a legal and governance expertise. Again, just having performance expertise, somebody who's got a performance lens on how you're actually operating, somebody with elite performance or high performance experience is really invaluable in these roles as well, because ultimately we don't look after, home nations look after the participation aspect of the business. We look after the elite performance aspect, and we can get distracted very easily and we can get diluted very easily. So having someone around the board table that understands the priority is to focus on the high performance needs of the business is pretty key, and being very focused. So it's that skill set really.
Reminds me of one of our earlier podcast guests, Owen Eastwood, who is a performance coach who I think has worked with various sort of leading sports entities. And it was just magic listening to the way he talked about the performance mindset and bringing that into the boardroom as well. How many boards themselves don't hold themselves to account in the same way that they would have done as executives, which always strikes me as a obvious gap.
It's really true. It's behaviors. I think it is behaviors. And actually, when you're in that executive position, you just need to get the job done, and you need to do it well. And you need to ensure that if you want to win, I don't think there's an executive that doesn't want to win or isn't driven to achieve the end state and achieve the mission that you've set out to achieve. If that's what you want to do, then you need individuals in the boardroom who have really clearly defined roles. That's the other part. Really clearly defined roles is so important, and being accountable. Because if you don't have either of those two in place and you don't have good methods of communication, it makes it almost, you don't move forward. It's fairly stagnant, and nobody's really taking accountability or is really clear on what their position is, and then you can't play to their strengths either. So they're probably not feeling valued about their role. And you end up in this very strange position where it's almost like teacher child position, where you're going in, you're delivering what they want to hear, and you're getting out as quick as you can. Who wants that? Nobody wants that. If you find yourself in that position, then it's painful and it's not right. It's not effective. You're not getting any value back from it. All you're doing is sucking your oxygen, your energy, and actually making you incredibly disillusioned. So it's ensuring that the board that you're operating with does not give you that sense.
If someone listening to this, sitting there thinking, gosh, Vicky, that's me. I'm in that position. What do I do?
Honestly, this comes down to the relationship with the chair and trust and being respected. Because I think that potentially an old-fashioned way of describing certain boards, right? Maybe I'm hoping it's becoming more of a thing of the past, because my experience as time has gone on is that actually the relationship between the chair and the CEO and the chair and the board members should be one of respect and should be one of understanding each other's skill sets and what they bring to the table. So I would hope that the relationship is such. It would make me concerned that actually the relationship wasn't as such if they were experiencing that, because I have been there myself. But if the trust is there, then you're in a position to then have a direct conversation with the chair or with the third to be able to express yourself and say, look, this is not working. Nobody's benefiting. I'm not benefiting from the expertise around the table because they're not adding value. I'm effectively giving over my homework and they're marking it. It doesn't feel like a collective exercise where I'm being checked and challenged in a constructive, positive way. It feels more like I'm walking into a classroom with a bunch of school teachers and they're marking the homework, and nobody's going to benefit from that, in particular the business. And it's very distracting, debilitating, and actually can slow you down.
So if you find yourself in that situation, effect a change.
You need to effect a change in one way or another.
Either you leave or you get...
Well, I was about to say eject. Slightly unprofessional of me. No, sorry.
That RAF training.
Yeah, eject, get out.
Let's move on to talk about, because you chair a couple of different organisations. I'm interested to hear your chair perspective. I mean, first of all, why did you take on those chair roles, and how on earth do you manage them alongside your CEO roles? Whenever people ask me if they should take on a chair role alongside a full-time executive, my guidance to them is no way. And famously, one of our past podcast guests who did ignore my advice, thankfully, and took on that chair role, said it's been the best thing he's ever done, and he listed my advice as the worst advice he'd ever received. I'm really curious to hear how you managed that.
So we put into perspective the magnitude of the chair role. The chair role for GB Surfing came about via a very good headhunter who approached me just as I was heading out to Beijing for the Olympics and said, look, this remit's come up. It was British Surfing at the time. They'd been awarded 1.3 million of funding 4 years ago for following Tokyo, when they announced that actually surfing was going into the Olympics. And so UK Sport had awarded this amount of money. But 2 years in, unfortunately, it was a very dysfunctional board with different competing agendas. And for a 2-year period, the money sat in the bank because UK Sport weren't comfortable with the lack of governance that had been put into play. And the dysfunctionality of the board was such that they were concerned that if the money went in, how is it going to be spent in the best way to effectively grow this foundation, to put surfers in the water and ultimately to become competitive for the Olympics in LA and then subsequently Brisbane. So I was approached about this remit because it was more like a startup, really. The money was 1.3 million for a 4-year period. They were obviously 2 years into this journey. And having put the foundations in place and learned numerous lessons with Snowsport, the parallels are hugely significant, albeit on a much smaller scale. So in Snowsport, you're talking across 12 disciplines. In surfing, you're talking one discipline and it was only the Olympics. And actually it quite excited me, having had my lessons from the board and actually what good looks like in a board, and the thought of actually pulling my own board together with different diverse skill sets, as we've discussed, was really exciting. And then appointing an executive that could take it to the next level was also exciting, because I do that fix it and I do like that startup mentality. And so I took it. It was initially, I'll be honest, I was thinking, can I do this? Do I have the time for this, that? And then I thought, if I took everything I've learned from Snowsport, it's effectively taking the blueprint and rolling it out into a smaller size organization. And I'm not doing the doing, but I can help with the lessons I've learned with the executive. And in terms of taking my time, we have very regular meetings because it's still quite young. I'm extremely proud that we got the governance set up. We brought in a kick-butt board with some brilliant skills, diverse skills, and we managed to navigate the complexity in this in-house fighting between the 4 different home nations so that they could feel actually empowered, enabled and valued to deliver what has become a really good platform for GB surfing and to enable our surfers to get to where they need to be for LA. It's been really exciting. It's a once a month meeting. It's pretty much to the point. Over communicate is really important, and collaborate, and lining out clear roles and responsibilities of that board has just made my life much easier. It's never always straightforward, let's face facts, because you've got people involved and they're never always straightforward. But there's far less of the competing agendas. There's a really good alignments and support of the executive now. That's just fun, to be quite honest with you. That's why I do it. The experts in the field are your players, right? You've got the best of the best. You've got the men and women who've been capped 100 times or more. And it's just finding innovative ways to use their platform to create a social impact on the global stage. And again, having a good executive that deliver against that means that your role is minimal. It's more strategic in helping support direction of travel more than anything else.
Before we move on to the lightning round, just want to quickly you built up an incredible portfolio in the sports world, which I think is an area that lots of our members are really interested in. Can you just give someone listening to this who perhaps hasn't ever taken on a board role in the sports world of the landscape and any sort of guidance you would give someone who's thinking about moving into a board role in the sports world?
Yeah, I think you've got a real variety, haven't you? You can have your unfunded roles, such as surfing is an unfunded role. So it's not paid for, your pro bono role, to say, or where you're paid. And that tends to be more in professional sport. I'd be strongly advocating for you to be doing a sport that you really are interested in and that you're passionate about. You don't need to be an expert in it. You certainly don't need to have played it. But if you're passionate about it and you're willing it to do well and you're engaged and you're intrigued, it's far better. You're going to take that passion and that energy into the boardroom and it will be contagious. So pick something that you genuinely are interested and passionate about that you can add value to, because you do spend a lot of time in these roles and you need to make sure you do have the time, because there is nothing worse than having a passenger, as I say, on the board. The worst types are the over-dominant and the non-contributors. They're my worst types. And I know I can almost label them when I walk in a boardroom. It's really bad. Now naughty's that, but they do. And so over-dominant, don't add. And non-contributor, don't add. And both can be distracting in one way or another. So I think don't be one of those people. Be somebody that's got the time, the capacity, the energy, and actually has really understood the role of the board and really understood the role of the organisation. So do your homework before you even think about entering into that space, and just understand, I went onto a particular board that is a paid role, but I thought I'd done really well on the due diligence, but I genuinely had no idea what I was walking into until I really walked into it. So I think taking the time to meet other board members as well before you jump in is really important. So I think that's going to be critical. And as I say, just ensure you've got the time, ensure that you understand what is you as well, and you can actually deliver that. There's nothing worse than going in and actually realize you don't have the skill set to really deliver what they need. And then you're letting yourself unmen down. It won't be a great experience for anybody, and you certainly won't learn from it.
And just before we go to the line round, you mentioned the paid roles are majorly for professional. The only paid role I can think of I've come across is the RFU board, where they pay their board members, although I think a lot of them end up donating their fee to charity. What are the other paid board roles in sports?
Some of the Olympic boards do actually pay, I found out recently. I think more in the chair position, whereas I thought Formula One paid as well. So some of the more professional sports like football, like Formula One, netball's paid as well. So it just depends. It's quite interesting. You don't really know. I was speaking to a colleague of mine actually who sits on the Olympic board, and fencing. They were recruiting for a fencing role. That chair role's paid. So I guess it just depends on what budget they have and whether they decide to pay the remits or not. A lot of the sports roles are not paid, but I would say that they are fantastic experience. And what you will learn in that sporting environment is so transferable to broader business, particularly if you get into somewhere where the high performance, it's a board that's focusing on delivering high performance, then you learn so much.
Okay, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response. You're ready?
No problem.
Best book every board member should read and why?
So The Effective Board Member, and what every board member should know. And the reason why is because I had to buy it to try and work out what was going on with my own board and then share it.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
Not listening.
Most valuable board ritual?
As a chair, I actually like to take that first 5 minutes to individually welcome everybody and find out how they are. I just think it personalizes the experience, and I enjoy doing that.
Favorite quote?
The brilliant quote that I've got it on my screensaver actually, and it always plays in my head. No greater waste of time than justifying your actions to people who have a life you don't want.
Most significant professional insight?
Trust is key.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
Profit is more important than culture.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
Actually, They are invaluable. They shouldn't be obstructive and distracting. They should be invaluable.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I made a judgment too quickly on an individual. Effectively, I wrote them off before they had an opportunity to actually demonstrate that they were absolutely valuable and pretty integral to the way forward. I wrote them off because they were probably too different to me, and I had their motivations completely wrong. I didn't take the time. And I've now learned actually to take the time to find out more, to get under the bonnet of individuals that are sitting around the board table, so you really understand them and what their motivations are, and that to enable them to understand you better. It's just taking that time. And life's so busy and your pressures are on and you're consistently dealing with competing priorities. But I think what a really important lesson I learned from that was to take the time to get to know the board members better.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I'm more focused and effective at understanding what the key priorities are.
Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Enable your people, empower your people, and remove the distractions.
Wow, Vicky, that has been a really inspiring discussion, which I've really enjoyed. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and wisdom.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
If you found this conversation interesting and would like to be involved in similar discussions, join the New Role Board community. Community membership gives you access to 24-hour discussion threads on boardroom challenges and opportunities like those we've been discussing, smart online networking events, one-to-one career sessions with our headhunters, third-party board roles, mastermind groups, and Q&As with senior board members. Head to community.newrole.com to find out more.